Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to the big tent. Welcome to the three-ring circus. My name's Lev Gonick. For those few folks perhaps that I haven't had a chance to say hello to yet, welcome to Cleveland, Ohio. Welcome to Case Western Reserve. Welcome to the backyard of the Case Connection Zone. And really, I want to just say thank you to all of you for taking time to join us here. And for those of you who are watching on the webcast, welcome as well. This is a propitious moment. It's a moment with incredible high stakes in the world of broadband and in the opportunities that lie ahead of us. There are many exciting activities in various stages of gestation around the development of ultra broadband across the nation. This gathering, this convening of the Big Tent is really just one small step along what will be no doubt a long journey. There are workshop activities, which I trust everyone is clear around 3 different tracks of work, effort underway, and we hope to both this afternoon provide you with a bit of a level set for those of you who know something about what your workshop is, but perhaps not what some of the other work efforts represent. And then tomorrow, just before we break around lunch, we'll get back together in here and have a bit of a summary of the activities in each of the workshops. I want to invite everybody to get comfortable, take off their jackets, undo their ties. The university is committed to a sustainability strategy, which this summer we have found out means going up an extra 2 degrees before the AC kicks on. So this is it. I trust everyone has found lots of wireless connectivity. There is thanks to the good work of One Community here in Cleveland, we have a 5 square mile wireless cloud for guests under either Case Guest or One Community Guest. I hope you'll take full advantage of it. We are in this building today until the end of our work efforts. If we've planned this right with the weather gods, we will be concluding and taking our half hour or so, 20 minutes, to walk across campus from 4:30 to 5. And the weather gods say that the skies are going to open at around 5:30. So that should be an incentive to get the work done. And join us this evening at around 5 or so for a couple of hours. The storm should pass, and it should be a really interesting evening thanks to a huge effort by people in this room and around the world, actually, who will be doing some of our demonstration activities. So to move them very quickly to our opening panel, a kind of level set conversation. I've asked our speakers to really sort of provide the level set of the work that they're engaged in, that many of you are engaged in with them, and then open up some conversations. So please don't be shy. This is an opportunity to make sure that everyone is feeling like they know whatever they want to know about again, this sort of an amazing set of generative activities that are taking place across the country in the area of advanced ultra broadband activities. So to start with, probably needing very little introduction in this room, but currently associated as an Aspen Fellow. Previously, as the principal architect and author of the National Broadband Plan, and before that, Chief of Staff for the FCC, a distinguished career on Wall Street. Blair Levin is going to speak right after Blair. Suzanne Iacono from the NSF, who directs activities that many of us are involved in the Computer and Information Sciences and Engineering group. Will be sharing some of the work that she and her colleagues, including myself and folks here at Case Western Reserve, are involved with. And then Jim Baller, who again, probably many people will know, long time legal mind in Washington, D.C., working with broadband communities. Previously co-chair, well, I still call him the chair, of the National Broadband Coalition. engaged in municipal activities that go back more than a quarter century in trying to stimulate the nation's municipal communities and thinking of their roles in providing utilities, including now broadband efforts. So I've asked them to speak each for maybe 7 or 8 minutes at most. I'll try to poke them if we need to, and then it's your job to please engage with them and make this a real good energy-filled opening, and then we will break to our various sessions. Do take a quick look at the program to know more or less where you're going. Those of you involved in working with Will and Susie will be staying here. The rest of us are dispersing. So with that, Blair Levin.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I want to talk about something kind of small, which was the broadband plan, and something really big, which is the American economy. But let me start by saying that one of the great pleasures of working on the broadband plan was we got to see a lot of examples of how local communities, such as what Lev had done here in Cleveland, or states such as what Jane Patterson did in North Carolina, really provided an inspiration for our team to understand that, you know, not all wisdom resides in Washington, D.C., and there were, in fact, a lot of role models that we could build on top of, and we certainly tried to do that. The fundamental goal of the broadband plan, properly understood, and I apologize because I actually don't think it's been properly understood, is that the United States needs a ubiquitous, diverse, and constantly improving broadband ecosystem of networks, devices, applications, and above all, people who know how to use them. And that's what's going to drive both the economic growth and the social change that the new communications platforms really give us the opportunity to utilize. And to do that, we looked at what are the gaps in that ecosystem. And when you think about ubiquity, it would be kind of on the low end, the ubiquity of how do you get networks everywhere, how do you get everybody on them. When you think about diversity, you think about things like competition policy, but also you think about how do you have applications which drive the public benefits. And in particular, we noted that when it comes to education and healthcare, and some other things like public safety, those are sectors which are way behind other sectors in the utilization of new technology. But often ignored in government policy is the importance of constantly improving. And in order to do that, we have to have certain kinds of networks, applications, devices, and people at the high end of the network who are pulling up the rest of the network, the next generation of all of those things. And government doesn't often think of itself as being involved in that, but if you actually look at the history of the internet, in fact, it was the government that was very much involved with that in terms of research institutions and in other ways funding the work that led to the constant improving internet. We're in a different era now. We now have a commercial internet, which we didn't have in the 70s and 80s when the government was involved. And so the way we do it has to be different, but it's a very important task. And two of the things that we thought we needed, one was, came out of a meeting that actually John Windhausen, who's here today and has done a lot of work with a variety of you, articulated a need for something, and this became the idea for USICAN, Unified Community Anchor Networks. And that is, how do you get a level of next generation network connectivity everywhere in the country? How do you lay that foundation? I'm very pleased that that was funded, that Internet 2 is now delivering on that promise. I think that when we look back, one of the most important recommendations of the broadband plan, but it really was the work of a number of people in this room that's going to make that the reality, and that's really great. Another one, though, and that's the focus of our GigU effort, is how do you get a critical mass of communities, not just the anchor institutions, but people utilizing advanced connectivity on a retail level and not an institutional level. And it's great that Google is doing that in Kansas City, but that's not enough for a variety of reasons, including it's not quite a critical mass. You want everybody engaged. We want all the network service providers to have their own strategy for an upgrade, and how do we inspire that? And we also want to put that kind of connectivity in the hands of people who are not just going to consume the bandwidth, but also create on it. So that's a very important effort that we think we can accomplish a lot. And hopefully over the next couple of days, we'll be focusing on a strategy. We have a strategy for doing that, and we're going to be trying to fill in the details. And that leads me to the really big thing, which is about the American economy. The most popular book kind of in the intellectual circles, in policy circles of Washington, D.C. right now is a book that interestingly was never published in physical form, but only the e-book version, a book called The Great Stagflation by an economist named Tyler Cowen. And in it, he argues that essentially, if we look at certain forces of natural resources and demographics and the result of the Second World War, it would be natural for the United States economy to thrive in that post-World War II environment, but that fundamentally that era is over and our economy is doomed to a level of stagnation. There's a lot of the book which is very thoughtful and probably right. But the interesting thing to me is what he completely ignores, or at least what I think he ignores, and that is the importance of innovation and the importance of creating wealth, not in the traditional ways of bringing gold out of the ground or some kind of manipulation of physical material, but rather with human creativity and thought and a spirit of creativity. Not just, by the way, on the side of the producers, but actually also on the side of the consumers. It's not an accident that great applications exist in the United States because of the work that was done earlier. But it's not just on the supply side, it's on the demand side as well. Americans are the most creative consumers of new items, and that's why things tend to get developed here. And while there's a lot to be concerned about in the broadband ecosystem, you have to like our hand. You have to like the fact that the most important broadband applications were created here. But that's not ordained in the future. And so while his book is a warning to us that we can't expect the kinds of growth that we have in the past, I think it is an error to suggest that it's impossible to do the same. But in order to do that, we have to be the ones who figure out how to use the great new platforms that enable certain kinds of communication so that the great surgeons at Case Western Medical Center can actually provide services throughout not just the country but throughout the world. We have to provide a platform so that the great educators at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, can not just offer the services to those who get to live in that wonderful town of Chapel Hill, but offer all kinds of applications around the world. We can do that as a country. I really think I was very fortunate to be at the FCC during a time of explosive growth in the sector in the 90s with both wireless and the internet. But I can foresee another kind of period of growth, but it requires a different kind of creativity. I think what ties all three sessions together is at the heart, it's about that. It is about how do we find new ways of creating value, how do we find new ways of meeting people's needs with this fantastic platform that is in the process of being created by many of the people in this room. And with that, I'll turn it over back to you.
Thanks so much, Blair. And with no further ado, Susie, welcome.
Okay, thank you, Lev. It's a great honor to be here today with you all. I think we have 2 exciting days ahead of us. As your token government servant up here, I want to say I'm here to help you. No, I want to talk about the National Science Foundation and its commitment to the notion that discovery and innovation in information technology are key drivers of this healthy, vibrant, competitive society that we have today. For over 3 decades, NSF has invested in the basic science and engineering of computing. The robust IT industry that you see out there today has emerged because of those investments that NSF made quite a long time ago. Not just NSF, other agencies, of course, are involved, and of course the private sector. But NSF does invest in or fund about 82% of the basic computer research that goes on across this country, and that's a huge proportion, right, of what goes on. And we know that this is a very long-term investment. As a society, we only reap the rewards of those investments many years later. And I think today we have a very special opportunity to leverage many of the investments that we have made to date, and to do something really big, really bold, really audacious, just what we're hearing about. And I think that's why all of you are here today. I want to thank Lev for his great forethought in planning this workshop a very long time ago, it seems like years ago, and offering to include USIgnite. At the time when he invited me, I wasn't really sure that we would be far enough along to actually benefit from this meeting. But here we are with a full slate of project teams already ready to present their idea for the Gigabit application, the Gigabit services that they think are going to benefit society. I know some of you are newcomers. Let me just say that USIgnite emerged out of a series of workshops and meetings starting back last January. Our goal, this is stated very, very simply and oversimplifying, is really to jumpstart Gigabit application development across the country in the areas that we consider national priorities: cyber learning, health IT, advanced manufacturing, smart transportation, public safety, clean energy. So this is the first time that GigU, Public Services in a Gigabit World, and USIgnite have tried to do something together. And I'm very happy to have this opportunity for us all to be together, meet each other, get to understand what we're trying to do. To date, seemingly we've been on separate paths, but I believe that we share the same vision. And that is of a United States that benefits from the next generation of technologies in ways that we can only imagine today. And to attain that future, we have to work together and figure out how we can develop synergies. Okay, so we had a meeting on May 16th in DC. Many of you were there. And one of the things that became quite clear to me is that we're not talking to each other. That is, there's islands of broadband across the country. There's providers with infrastructure, with resources, hungry for entrepreneurs, researchers to come and take advantage of that infrastructure and develop new services that are going to benefit people. At the same time, we've got researchers funded by NSF, entrepreneurs that have venture funding, that have prototypes, systems. And they're just using them in the lab or on a very small scale. And they would love to see them deployed in a much larger setting. Well, guess what? I think we need to fix this, right? Let's break this stalemate. Let's really do something. Okay, so how are we going to do it? Also at the May 16th meeting, Anish admonished us, if you all will recall, do not think in terms of nouns. No, nouns are forbidden. We have to think about action. We have to think about the verbs. What is it that we're doing? Why are we doing it? And so I think there are many components, many players in this ecosystem, this broadband ecosystem that we're talking about that are necessary to achieve this future. But the question really for us today is how do we get from where we are to this future that we can all imagine? I think first we have to engage in integration. We have these islands of broadband that I mentioned. We can connect them. We should use them. We have campuses and universities across the country. They need upgraded connectivity. They need access to advanced experimental networks. We have some advanced experimental network infrastructure out there. We would like to deploy it very widely. We would like the anchor institutions to better serve the public. I think that that's what you want to do. And we have citizens out there who really want to maintain or achieve a higher quality of life. I think that we can bring good things to these people. Next, we need to develop partnerships. And I think this means public-private partnerships. As well as across the U.S. government. NSF can't do this alone. NSF and OSTP can't do it. We need everyone to pitch in with your resources in whatever way that you possibly can. And then finally, we need to innovate. So what are those gigabit applications and services that are really going to make a big difference in the future? I really want to hear about them, and I can't wait for the next session to hear what people are thinking. It's really, really exciting. With that, I want to thank Will Barkus. I don't know where Will's, my helper over here. He's been talking to tons of you. He's really been a big part of making the USIgnite part of this workshop happen. And I want to thank Nick Maynard over there from OSTP for continuing support from the White House. And I see John Piha is here. So he's now at CMU, but he was the one that did the first workshop back in January that brought a very small group of people together to start talking about this. But as Lev said, this is a big tent. We've only just begun. We really need to bring more people in. I'm thrilled to see so many people here excited by this notion because I think we really can make a difference right now. I thank you all for coming. Can't wait to meet people that I haven't met yet. I think we really can work together to achieve this bright future. Thank you.
Thanks, Susie. Terrific. Jim, that was a great tee up. So take us home in this first round.
Okay. Lev, thank you so much for having me here today. I too feel like the rest of you deeply honored to be included in this group. In fact, as many of you out there who know me have often heard me say, I consider myself to be the most fortunate attorney in the country for having the opportunity every day to work with communities to help themselves to a better future through advanced communication services and capabilities. And from my perspective, I think that we have had just a tremendous year over the course of the last year. Blair recently commented on the National Broadband Plan having had a good year. But beyond the National Broadband Plan, we've seen thousands of organizations and millions of people focusing on broadband, thinking about what life in their communities currently is and could be, about what the broadband universe could be like if we could tap into it more quickly to obtain more robust broadband, to ensure that all Americans are part of that process. We've gotten there through the work on the National Broadband Plan. We've gotten there through the work that communities and individuals have done through the Broadband Stimulus Program. Google ignited the country with its community fiber initiative. Chattanooga, Lafayette, on and on and on. This has been a tremendous year, and all of that energy is going to converge as the projects get built, as we learn more and more about what is working, what is not working well. And so I think we've made geometric progress over the course of the last year. And still, I think for most of us, we know that the world will inevitably move toward gigabit or very high broadband connectivity, that sooner or later it will happen, very much so in the U.S. and other leading nations. We know that the U.S. is not at the head of this development, that other nations, particularly Asian nations, are moving faster than we are today. And we also know that the nations that provide affordable access to high-capacity broadband services and capabilities, those nations are going to be the ones that are most successful in the century ahead. The question is, how can we work today to accelerate that process right here in the United States? And I couldn't be happier to be part of a gathering like this and others around the country where that question is now a very serious question. So over the course of the last year, the White House has initiated a number of initiatives, and others in the federal government have initiated a number of initiatives to take a look at that question and see what we can do to accelerate our path to high capacity or gigabit broadband connectivity. They've also done other things. They focused on job creation through programs like Startup America. And here we have Ignite and Gigabit University. And I'd like to talk to you about a related initiative that I've been working on that I believe can supplement these other programs, and in addition to that, focus on areas that are not the focus of these other programs as well. Over the last, it's actually 18 years, not quite a quarter century yet, I've been involved in scores of community broadband and other kinds of communications initiatives, including about 30 or 40 fiber to the home projects, as well as other interesting kinds of leading edge projects that are not necessarily community owned but are community driven, including projects like One Community here in northeastern Ohio. And in that time, one thing that has emerged to me as a compelling reality is that economic development and job creation and retention is always, without exception, the #1 driver of the project. No matter what specific business model communities are considering, whether it's private, public partnerships, whether it is publicly owned, whether it's some combination of it, the single most recurring driver is economic development. And on top of that, we have evidence, we have lots of evidence that there is a connection between broadband and economic development and job creation. Now, we don't have scientifically provable relationships. We can't say that if you invest $1 here, you'll get a $5 return there. We don't have that kind of data, but we have lots of anecdotal data of hundreds of jobs coming into communities because the community has made a commitment to developing high-capacity networks. Lafayette's a good example. Even before they built their fiber to the home project, just knowing it was going to be there attracted a new employer promising 1,000 jobs to that community. And we've given example after example to the Federal Communication and to the other agencies. So we know that that relationship exists in some form. But what do we really know about economic development? And that's what got me to thinking, how much do we really know about what economic development is? What flavors it comes in? We know, for example, that some flavors of economic development produce very high revenues for companies, but not necessarily jobs. We know some produce some kinds of jobs and not other kinds of jobs. For example, an economic development project that results in a call center is different from an economic development project that results in a high technology manufacturing or services organization. So there's a lot we don't know about strategies of economic development. We don't know what the resources are. We in the broadband community don't know that much about what the Economic Development Agency or administration of the Department of Commerce is doing, and they don't know very much about what we're doing. There's room for multidisciplinary mutual education and learning at all levels. And so it occurred to me that we should get together and talk about these things. And so we organized a full-day program on broadband economic development and job creation that we held in Dallas on April 28th. And we brought to that program thought leaders and experts from across the spectrum, site selectors, people involved in U.S. competitiveness issues, persons involved in economic development from the economic development world, those involved at the local world from the broadband side of it. You name it, we had them at this conference. And all day during this conference, we had just remarkably thoughtful and interesting discussion among people crossing all of these borders. And throughout the day and afterwards, I repeatedly heard from people, wow, this is great. We should not let this be just a one-shot affair. We should develop mechanisms for ongoing multidisciplinary learning and communication and collaboration. And so, in the closing session, we asked the remaining people there, what should we do? What kinds of thoughts do you have about where we should go from here? And among the things that were suggested was that we should do what we did in the work of our U.S. Broadband Coalition that Lev mentioned earlier. There, we had formed a group of more than 160 organizations of all kinds, incumbent carriers, educators, public entities, state, local, utilities, you name it, all across the board, focusing on whether we need a comprehensive national broadband plan and what the framework should be for such a plan. We worked for a period of over a year developing, breaking down that question into its component parts, forming working groups to study and report on it, having chairs of working groups that represented different points of view of all those issues. And at the end of the day, in December of 2008, we had a call to action to Congress asking for Congress and the incoming president to treat broadband as a high priority, that we should have broadband stimulus, and that we should require that we should have a national broadband plan, that it was urgent to have such a thing. Congress enacted the Recovery Act, which included a provision requiring the Federal Communications Commission to develop the plan that Blair was so intimately involved in doing. We had the broadband stimulus program, and there were those who suggested we should mount a similar effort, focusing this time on broadband economic development and job creation. And while that is a simpler task in some ways, because it's only one of the many issues that we tackled in the context of our U.S. Broadband Coalition, it's also more complex because it takes an issue and drives deeply into it and cuts across many other components of our economy and will be just as broad. And so while I'm here today, I'm in the process of thinking through how to do this, what the deliverables would be, who would benefit from knowing more about how to do economic development, how to provide resources to communities, to others who would work with them, to feed into the IGNITE program, into the GigU program, into Startup America and all the others. And I look forward to your ideas. More important, I look forward to your involvement. I hope that you'll step up and join us in this effort, because there's nothing, in my view, more important than robust communities across the country developing jobs from which people can not only earn a living, but fulfill themselves and make our country, in the next century, the great country that it has been over the last two. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. So I'm just about to turn the floor over to you, but just before that, I just want to throw a softball back to the panel and ask them to, again, just as this is a table stakes conversation right now, just kind of a level set. So you've heard these sort of three broad initiatives. You've heard them connected basically to the national purposes, to the very kind of high, lofty goals. And I'm looking for a kind of a crisp one-liner that will help those here and those who are viewing understand the linkages. And I'll just go basically back through the order in which we started. Okay, Blair. So we understand the GigU initiative is to work, we think, probably with universities and communities. What more is it worth us knowing about the Gig.U effort in the context of the national purposes goals, which you did a nice job framing, but let me give you one more chance to bring it home.
I didn't do it well enough, apparently.
No. I just want to make sure we got it all right here.
In one sentence, I can't do it. I'm going to try two.
All right.
Though I'm going to use a semicolon. One mountain, many paths. This particular path involves a strategy of trying to focus private investment, incremental private capital to build next generation networks, world-leading networks, in those communities where the private investment gap between employment, deployment, and demand is the narrowest, and where the consumers of that next generation service are the most likely to create both the economic private sector kinds of applications and the public sector public applications in healthcare, education, public safety, research and development, and other kinds of things.
Terrific. Okay, so nice framing, I think. At least I'm hearing it in a crisp fashion. I'm hoping that if you want additional, and that you will actually ask for additional insights. Susie, let me ask you to also, once again, reframe the USIgnite initiative in the context of national purposes and your call to action among the research community, the entrepreneurs, and others in federal agencies, as we heard you outline.
I liked your first question, the one you posed to him.
Okay, good. You can answer that one then. Go for it.
Okay, so I just want to make the linkages, right? I think that's kind of an important thing for us to begin to do right now, and I need more than one sentence, obviously. But very simply stated, at NSF, we know that many of the innovators are on our campuses, right? And so if we want to reach those innovators and give them a platform on which to innovate, then we need to give them advanced networking platforms where they can play. You know, it's a playground for them. So I see that as a connection with GigU, right? And then we have to show, I believe, that it's critical to show that what we're doing has some benefit. We're not just building infrastructure just to build infrastructure, build it and they will come. We have to show that the investments that this country makes really matter. And they matter to all kinds of people. And so I think that's the hook in with anchor institutions, public services, right? So we have to show that kids who have a mentor, you know, via some kind of cyber learning system, can do better in their STEM classes. We have to show that homebound elderly have a higher quality of life if they can have, you know, high presence telecommunications with their grandchildren over dinner, right? These are your examples, Lev, right? And so I think that we have to show that. And that is what's going to get people excited, the entrepreneurs. I think that we also have to show that there are business models that also relates to what you were saying, that people who do this really can start to make a difference in new jobs and improving the economy.
Okay, great, Susie. So, Jim, when we talk about public sector, we think of government, but we also think of libraries, museums, public broadcasters, public health care, public education. What loaf of bread do we bring to the table in this conversation about both national purposes and this opportunity to really be focused in on the economic development element in the equation, as well as opportunities for linkages to these other initiatives?
I'd say that what we're doing in this room is creating an electricity kitchen. In the 20s and 30s, electricity did not sell itself. As people now think of electricity as a commodity service that obviously drives everything that we do at home, at work, and at play. And many of us think that high-capacity broadband connectivity can do the same thing in this coming century, but it wasn't always obvious. The electric utilities in the 20s and 30s had to create demonstration kitchens and demonstration houses to show people what they could do with electricity, what appliances could work over them, and so on and so forth. If you go to Glasgow, Kentucky, you can still visit the kitchen that they used over the years. And in a sense, that's what we're doing right here. Broadband, even high-capacity broadband, in and of itself is interesting but meaningless. What matters is how people can use it, and one of the things that we don't yet have as a nation is a vision of what we can do with that connectivity. Some years ago, the mayor of Salt Lake City rejected participation in the Utah project because he said he couldn't envision anything lawful that one could do with all of that broadband. And so what we're doing here, I think, is creating this century's version of an electric kitchen.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, folks, we've got 20 minutes for a conversation about level setting, making sure that there's good understanding of essentially the petri dish or the the demonstration efforts, but also that there's really been a significant amount of effort, time, engagement underway that all of us in this room, in one way, shape, or form, have are associated with. I'd like to invite you to throw a question forward, and I'll do my best just to repeat it so that for those who are listening online to get a chance. So first question, also please just introduce yourself briefly, Galen.
Galen Updike, I'm from Arizona. I manage the NTIA SPDD project for Arizona, both mapping and planning. And my question is to Jim. It has to do with the economic development side and how you measure it. And we struggle with in Arizona a lot. We have disbelievers and we have Luddites in our legislature, and we have a whole raft of...
You may not be alone, Galen, in your legislature.
I talked to Jane recently.
And the folks from Wisconsin aren't here because of their issues at the moment.
But nevertheless, we don't have compelling statistics that, and we've had 15 years worth of studies. What's the formula going to be to make it compelling? What do we have to do? And is there something that we can come together on to measure how broadband really does impact economies?
Okay, so let me just very briefly, just for those who are particularly listening online, repeat that Galen's question from Arizona really has to do with trying to communicate, find the language based on as much quantitative measurement or other measurements that provide compelling evidence of the relationship between broadband planning, deployment, and use, and economic development.
I've got the British study in 2001 or 2002. I've got the New Zealand study and the Australian study. I got nothing from the U.S.
Right, and so in addition to Jim responding to that, I'm going to invite Blair, and if Susie would like to as well, just to comment. And it's a really good question that all of us, both in our local sandboxes and those of us involved in regional and national activities, that's a really good question, Galen. So Jim, do you want to start with a thought or two?
Well, first from the process standpoint, I view my task as being to ask the questions and gather the people who have experience and wisdom in answering questions like that. When word about our Economic Development Day got out, I heard from many economists who wanted to be part of it. Our day could have been a week. There are many different views about that process. Jane is going to pull economists together to address that very question. And so it's a fair question. If you go to our website, you'll find a great many studies, but I don't think the studies really prove in statistically valid ways what the relationship is. It is an important first question. It's part of answering the question, well, what can I do to accelerate and improve the chances of creating jobs, retaining jobs, bringing businesses in? It's part of that question. And what I'm proposing to do is to bring people on all sides of those questions together to answer them, because we don't have the answers right now. And if we do a better job of getting those answers, we'll do a better job of framing direct action to attempt to achieve the
And the problem is we're
answer.
always across the table, never on the same side of the table from the policymakers.
Right, and that's one of the things that Jim did a great job with in the first iteration of the National Broadband Coalition. And I think it's one of the reasons that, among other things, Blair was listening to the coalition because it did represent the less of an adversarial role and looking for common ground, not hiding from areas where there wasn't, exact consensus. But maybe I can also just, ask Blair. More than one politician has probably asked you to frame it in economic development terms. How, in general, do you think about the question?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, I think we have to get away from the model of thinking one size fits all. And we have to match up a technology with a use case. One of the things, I'm here arguing on behalf of the need for much higher speed networks to certain communities, which if anybody who's followed my 95% of the speeches I've given in the last year have actually been to the opposite effect, which is we spend way too much money as a country focusing on high-speed networks to rural residential homes, and not enough focus on wireless, which will be the big driver of economic growth in the next decade. I always say, but nobody notices, that, however, if you think about the use case of where we need much higher speeds, it's generally in research institutions, hospitals, and research communities. So it's really about matching up a use case with a technology. There's a wonderful essay written in the early 90s by a guy, Stanford economic historian Paul David, called The Computer and the Dynamo, which talks about this very phenomenon, really, but not with networking, but just with computers. I believe it was the paradox, the Solow paradox. Computers show up everywhere but in the productivity statistics. And he was talking about what he saw with electricity 100 years earlier and what was now being seen with computers, which is, for a general purpose technology, it is very hard to measure the impact on productivity, in part because you're measuring the wrong thing, because it is inevitable that you measure the wrong thing in the early stages, but also because people aren't using it effectively. And he points to this example where for many years electricity wasn't really being utilized by factories. Electricity really started in the 1880s, but it wasn't until the 1910s that Henry Ford and others figured out how you can completely refigure a factory to make it horizontal as opposed to vertical. And that's what really developed into the tremendous manufacturing gains, which people thought in some ways had already, there were tremendous manufacturing gains from the 1700s to the late 1800s, but it was really a next generation. And I think you'll get the same thing with broadband. But I don't know it, and I don't want to pretend that I know it, and I'll just finish by saying that I think this argues strategically for approaching it in a couple of different ways. First of all, and this is part of what we've done in thinking about how we do this with GigU. Number one, we should be talking about private sector money. We should be talking about it in terms of R&D. We all recognize the very difficult circumstances that the public sector is in. If we were at a different stage, we might have a different strategy. But this is about how do we improve the business case for incremental public sector investment. And secondly, it is in the context of experimentation. We should understand this is about test beds. This is about not trying to roll out something where you don't know what's going to happen, but it is about being very sophisticated and smart about different business models, about different technologies, about the different business cases, and trying to see what we can do as a community to close that private investment gap as opposed to looking to a, you know, it was certain people criticized the broadband plan for not going to the United States government and simply asking for the $333 billion that we estimated it would take to get every home in America 100 megabits. You know, reasonable minds can differ, but I certainly do not apologize for not asking Congress for that money. I don't mind being laughed with, but being laughed at is a different proposition. And if I'd asked for $300 billion, I would have been laughed at and should have been laughed at. But that means we have to be very smart about the approach and not overpromise, but rather overdeliver.
Okay, and Susie, I know you invoked Anish Chopra in not using nouns, but using verbs and action items. Is economic development in your mind, as you think about it, been misused traditionally as a kind of state, a noun, rather than thinking about it perhaps as Blair's and Jim have both suggested as a kind of activity?
Yeah, it's very much an activity. And so guess who funded Paul David's work?
I bet you did.
I'm
just guessing.
I absolutely did, yes, because what he shows is the link between technological change and social change. And the point that you're making is that you can't take a new technology and put it into an old situation, right, and expect that it's going to make a big difference. In fact, you have to change the social environment, the work environment that's around it. He calls it regime change, right? So you have to actually make people realize they have to do things differently. So part of what we're doing here is we're seeding, you know, small research projects, teams. That's what NSF loves to do, and mini seeds, because we don't know which of those will grow into flowers. But at the end of the day, it's really about what actually happens, right? And so we're trying to mobilize interest. And so how do we convince people? I don't think that studies actually convince people of what they should do, what actions they should take. I think it's what they see and what they get excited about. And so we're trying to develop this ecosystem, this broadband ecosystem that's thriving, that's interesting, that people want to be part of because they see it's a new way of doing things. But back to the social change, it still won't fly. It still won't really do the things we want for economic development unless we change the way we do business.
I want to open get another comment or question. Larry, did you have one?
Well, I guess I have to speak for Wisconsin.
That's true. Larry is here halfway between Washington and Madison.
So an observation, one of the reasons the internet was so successful, has been so successful, is that for almost 2 decades, it flew beneath the radar. We did our research, we built the community, we developed applications, and in fact then, fortunately, the web came along. And that's the reason it became a major commercial success. Somehow, with what we're doing now, we seem not to perhaps made the case, and maybe that's because we're not flying beneath the radar. So, for example, in the Wisconsin case, I have a letter from all of the small telcos in the state of Wisconsin requesting the legislature to not allow any state institution, University of Wisconsin, to participate in BTOP projects. So in fact, the legislation that the Wisconsin legislature is passing is going to require the university to return $39 million to the federal government. But this is all of the small telcos in the state. So somehow that means that we haven't done a good enough case. AT&T is also on board in fighting all such things. As a side effect, the legislation is also going to require that UW-Madison drop out of Internet 2. Okay, so we have, yes. So if you know anybody in the legislators in Wisconsin, but the point is, what I'm worried about is maybe we've made mistakes. So one mistake is no BTOP proposal should have been funded perhaps unless the incumbent telco was a partner. That was probably a mistake not to insist on that, because I think what's happening in Wisconsin is happening elsewhere. So my question is, what do we do? How do we get out of this conundrum? And how do we convince the corporations and the politicians in our various states that this really is to their benefit and really will lead to job creation and economic development?
Right, and so for those of you watching, Larry's sort of essential question, if you will, is this is a high-stakes conversation because we haven't been flying under the radar, and there's a lot of public funding in the scope, and folks in public legislatures are dealing with those political realities. Well, what can we do was his question about the conundrum, I'll just use your words, that we find ourselves in to continue to try to advance the work that's outlined. This is not a conversation right now about national broadband. This is a conversation about advanced, pre-commercial, scientific and other activities that we've been talking about here, but it still perhaps warrants the question, how do we make sure that these nascent activities that we're talking about don't become casualties of this broad, sweeping issue? Blair, do you want to give a thought or two, or others from the audience want to chime in? This is obviously a hot potato.
Comments about Wisconsin are acceptable.
First of all, I just want to say I don't think that's actually true of most of the BTOP grants. That is to say, I think while there was a lot of incumbent telco and cable objection, in most places the money was not returned. But it has been an issue in a variety of places. And let me be clear, I was not involved in that program, so there's a lot of stuff I don't know about it. I would just make two very quick observations. First of all, while I think it would not have been possible to say that an incumbent should be part of every grant, that because of the structure of the BTOP program and what Congress asked NTIA to do, I do think it is important that as we think about this, it's not adversarial. That is to say, the GigU, I've talked to all the incumbent telcos and cable guys, and I say, we'd like to use market forces to try to drive new private investment. But we want to do it in a way which improves your business case. This is not about state competition. This is about what are the things that can be done on both the demand side and the supply side that improve your business case. So we want, on that sense, to be on the same, absolutely on the same side of the table with multiple potential providers, and then let the competitive forces drive it. And the other thing I would say about Wisconsin is, in terms of a kind of the political context, debates tend to get resolved on the basis of the framework they begin with. And if the framework is public investment in what most people see as a private sector process, if the debate is about that private sector, that public sector involvement, we're going to lose that debate. I think the debate, we should understand. I think very highly of a lot of things that were done under BTOP. I'm obviously a big supporter of the UCAN proposal. But where I think the problem is how do you frame things in a way in which people understand the traditional role of government in assuring that our research institutions, which, by the way, if you think about the assets of the American economy, and this is going back to Tyler Cowen's book, the single most important asset for an information-based global economy and the single best asset that the United States has is its research institutions. And in fact, I would argue it's the last great asset that we have. 50 years ago, we had many great assets. It is the single most important and greatest asset that we have. And people, I think, recognize a public role in making sure that those exist, in part because of the great public institutions like Michigan and Wisconsin and Illinois and Chapel Hill and Virginia and Case Western.
Not as publicly funded as we might want.
Right. And ASU, absolutely. I could bore you all by going through the entire list of GigU participants. But I think the case has to be made that if we want to retain that leadership, that investment has to be made. And it's got to, there are certain things we really do need the private sector to do. There are other things which traditionally have been public sector. And we, if the private sector wants to build the great network, give them the chance. So there is a framing element that has to be done correctly here.
Okay, Jim, briefly, and then we'd like to take at least two comments or quick questions. We're into overtime at this point, but Jim.
Okay, on the question of public versus private and so on and so forth, things are not nearly as bad as you may think they are. One state, two states this year don't make a tidal wave. Over the, we were in worse shape in 2004 when we lost a case before the Supreme Court saying that states can tell local governments that they can't get involved in this area. And then we were beaten to a pulp in Pennsylvania in a fight over a barrier to entry there. And we expected that following those two events in 2005, we would see new proposed state barriers all across the country. And we pulled together a huge national coalition that included high-tech companies and organizations supporting local governments and consumer groups and what have you. And the message of that coalition was that restrictions of this kind are not good for the communities involved, they're not good for the private sector, and they're not good for the country. We were successful in stopping or watering down almost all of the 14 bills that were introduced in 2005, and until this year, we defeated every bill introduced in every state every year, including in North Carolina in 3 of the last 4 years when bills were introduced. What is important to do now is to rebuild the messaging, to work with the private sector where it is possible to do that, but to emphasize that ultimately it's a local choice. If the private sector won't step forward and provide the kind of services that the community needs and wants, then it should be up to the community to make the determination as to what's in the best interest of that community. That's what the National Broadband Plan says in words of one syllable. Now, local governments are not wild-eyed radicals who want to compete with the private sector. For the most part, they are risk-averse and conservative. The decision makers have to live in the community where they are subject to tremendous pressure. If a project goes down, they're going to wear that shirt in the community for a very long time. And so, given the process that happens when a public project is under consideration, it's debated for months in taxi cabs, in barber shops, in the local media, over and over again. The private incumbents step forward and question every assumption that's made, every business decision, every potential technological change. And those projects that, only those projects that have a need that's not being met, that won't be met by the private sector, and that have a good chance of being successful over the useful life of the assets and the bonds that are used to fund them, go forward. As a result of that, there have been very few failures of public projects. What we need to do is to rebuild our coalition, get the message out, get it out earlier. We have, to stop the legislation in Wisconsin and anywhere else they may be introduced this legislative session, and to get ready for the next year and maybe roll back some of the laws that currently exist.
All right, Jim. So I want to just give 2 comments to Jane, and we'll go to the back of the room. And we're going to have lots of conversation, right? We're going to have 90 minutes now, right after this session, deep inside each of your respective workshops. We're going to have lots of time for conversation over wine and cheese and on and on. So this is not the last word. These are just the first word. And if I could just ask you to try to frame your comments now, both of these last 2 comments, in the context of what's on the table as opposed to the national broadband story. That's as big a tent as I would like us to think we're under. I'd like to focus in on that pre-commercial, advanced broadband piloting conversation that we began with, and to try to just avoid, if at all possible, solving the next state. Jane?
Wow, there goes my question. I would say that I think each of these, government, private sector, I'm giving each of them what they said, government, private sector, and also public-private. There we have to invite everybody to the table, even those that may have turned down our collards or whatever we offered, because they need to be asked to be involved in this and to be a part of the process. And there will be a lot of boulders on this non-level playing field, but I think what you're trying to do here is critical for the basic economy of this country and critical for the social well-being of every citizen. So I would hope that everybody here would come to the process to work with that. I would just say one other thing, and that is that when we look at the transition of any technology into the environment you're in, you overlook sometimes the simplest things where the cost and you can prove that things are really, saving you money. All the work that we've done at NSF and all the efforts to do with interactive learning, I can take that and show you the tremendous savings to the family from kids getting through college early, the state from not having to build new buildings, kids who are doing chemistry in Podunk, North Carolina, who could never have had chemistry without it being interactively brought to them, and show you that we are changing the way we look at delivering education.
And Jane, probably that's got something to do with the messaging that Jim was referring to. And so from the wisdom of collards in North Carolina to Cajun country, last word for this session, or at least last comment.
Jeff Daly, Lafayette, Louisiana. I want to make a quick comment that kind of ties these things together in that way. And I think the challenge we face is that we haven't done a good enough job of defining as a country what is the infrastructure what is the broadband infrastructure of tomorrow that we need in order to continue to be competitive in the 21st century. If you look back to the 20th century, we didn't just have roads, we didn't just have telephone systems, we didn't just have electricity. We had the highest capacity, lowest cost, most ubiquitous infrastructure, and that's how we won the 20th century. So now the problem is we get caught up in these debates around, does the broadband we have today, is it sufficient, is it not sufficient? When we need to be talking about how we build the infrastructure for tomorrow. And why I'm so excited about what we all have here today and the opportunity we have is that we need to do a better job of defining what that tomorrow looks like.
Great.
So that people can understand why we need to go build these networks in order to realize that tomorrow.
Great, Jeff. And I think that's the ecosystem that Susie was talking about. I think that's the integrated approach that Blair was calling for, and this kind of coalition, the broadband coalition, the second version that obviously Jim is proposing that we work on. I want to give the last word to our panelists, a closing sentence that will inspire us as we go to our respective destinations. Again, those of you in the USIgnite program, you can certainly stretch your legs. The clock is on. Get a refreshment. The rest of us have a chance to stretch our legs and move just to other rooms here in Dively. Again, a reminder that as close to 4:30 as is humanly possible. We'd like to encourage you to begin joining your local ambassadors to walk across campus for our happy hour and a little bit of living the future today. Demonstrations that many of you have been working on with us for the evening. It's an hors d'oeuvre kind of evening, so if you're looking for dinner suggestions afterwards, we've got a whole bunch of them to offer you. But 4:30, the other reason to be thinking about 4:30 is because right now at around 5:30, the skies are supposed to open up. It's about a 15 to 20-minute walk across campus, knowing the lingering and so forth. As close to 4:30 as possible would be a really good idea. Last word, Susie, why don't you just sort of share a last thought on this opening kickoff session?
Okay, I think that we're really at the frontiers here. We really don't know how to move forward. We're asking for big socio-technical changes in the country, and I think that we all have to learn together. This is something that is emerging. We do not have all of the solutions in place at this point in time, but I ask for you all to be ambassadors for this. Become emissaries. Please go back to your institutions and talk about what's going on, because we need everyone in this big tent,
Great.
Including the private folks.
Jim?
The mental picture I have is the number of vectors pointing in the same direction, and I think that all of those vectors can be more successful in moving in the directions they're going if we make a helix of them and work together.
Okay, we've got different images starting. Okay, what can you do with that, Blair?
Well, let me just close by, in 1985, a friend of mine showed me this huge brick of a thing called a cell phone and said, you know, for $1,200 a month, you could have this. And I said, why would I or anyone in the world want that thing? He is now very graciously retired, having sold his cellular company back in the early 90s. What he saw was not what was, but what could be. And that's the thing I would urge all of us to say. I think we have the opportunity with the people in this room to really create that kind of dynamic for ultra broadband.
Thank you, Blair. Thank you, Susie. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, all of you. We are not recessed, but to make a stretch and move to our respective destinations. I see a couple of you actually have the program right in front of you. Could you just quickly, I'll read the locations here as we move out. 214, we're joining Jim and company.
And I go back a long ways.
I'm a big admirer of
Sorry, uh-oh. All right, let's step outside and we'll get directions for everybody except the USIgnite.